I still remember the sound my heels made on that marble floor. Sharp, cold, the kind of click that makes you feel small even when you're trying to stand tall. It was a Thursday night in late September, and the office building downtown was nearly empty. Just the hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of a cleaning crew somewhere on another floor. The elevator had that sterile smell, like lemon cleaner and recycled air. My reflection stared back at me from the polished doors, a woman I barely recognized, pale, determined, scared. I had told myself 100 times not to go, not to check, not to let my suspicions turn me into the kind of woman who shows up unannounced at her husband's office at 9:30 at night. But there I was, pushing through the glass doors of Armstrong Legal Consulting, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my car keys. The security guard at the front desk didn't even look up. He was used to lawyers working late, used to spouses bringing dinner in paper bags, used to people coming and going at all hours. He just waved me through. My husband Mark had been different for months, distant, careful with his phone, working late 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. And when I asked him about it, he would smile that warm smile I'd trusted for 40 years and tell me he was handling something important, something that would secure our future. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, but my instincts kept screaming. The way he'd close his laptop when I walked into a room, the way he'd started receiving mail at his office instead of home, the way he'd look at me sometimes like he was measuring something, calculating. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning and find his side of the bed empty. I'd go downstairs and see the light on in his home office, the door closed, his voice low on the phone. When I asked who he was talking to, he'd say a client. Time zone differences, he'd explain. International business, but we lived in a small Midwestern town. His clients were local, small businesses, estate planning, real estate transactions, nothing that required midnight phone calls. That night, standing in the hallway outside his private office, I heard voices, low, urgent. And then I heard my name, not the way you hear your name in casual conversation, but the way you hear it when people are talking about you, discussing you, making decisions about your life without you in the room. I stopped breathing. I pressed my back against the wall, my purse clutched to my chest, and listened. Mark's voice, deep, strained, saying something about time running out, about protecting assets, about her not needing to know until it was done. And then another voice, female, young, saying, "Mr. Armstrong, this isn't right. You promised you'd tell her. You said she'd agreed." Mark's response was sharp. "Julie, I know what I'm doing. Trust me. This is the only way." My hand was on the doorknob before I realized I'd moved. I opened the door without knocking. The sound it made, swinging open on well-oiled hinges, felt like thunder. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. My husband wasn't alone. Julie Sinclair, his young legal assistant, was there, and the look on both their faces told me I had just walked into the middle of something I was never supposed to see. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Enjoy the rest of the video. The thing is, I had always been the kind of wife who trusted, maybe too much. My mother used to say I was too soft, too willing to believe the best in people. She'd warned me, years ago, that blind trust was dangerous, that even good men could make bad choices when they felt cornered. But I'd dismissed her warnings as cynicism. Mark and I had built a life together that people admired. We married young, back in 1984, when interest rates were sky high and nobody had money for anything fancy. Our wedding was in my parents' backyard. My dress was borrowed. The cake was homemade. We honeymooned at a state park 3 hours away. We bought a little house on the edge of town with a mortgage that terrified us, 30-year fixed at 14%. We painted every room ourselves. We planted trees that are now taller than the house. We raised 2 kids in that house, Danny and Michelle. We added on a sunroom when Mark's consulting business started doing well. We paid off that mortgage in 22 years, making extra payments whenever we could. I remember the day we burned the mortgage papers in the fireplace. Mark had opened a bottle of champagne. We danced in the kitchen. We'd felt invincible. We saved. We planned. We talked about retiring somewhere warm, maybe near the coast in South Carolina, maybe just staying put and finally enjoying the home we'd worked so hard to keep. We'd go to estate sales on weekends, imagining the furniture we'd buy when we had more time. We'd talk about traveling, seeing the Grand Canyon, taking a cruise, simple dreams, modest dreams, but they were ours. Mark had always been the steady one, the provider, the man who handled the business side of life while I managed the home, the kids, the endless logistics of family. I trusted him with our finances the way you trust gravity. It just was. I knew we had retirement accounts. I knew we had savings. I knew the house was paid off. I signed tax returns without reading them. I let him handle the investments. I didn't ask questions because I didn't think I needed to. That was my first mistake. Not the trusting, but the not asking. Because trust without knowledge is just another word for vulnerability. But 6 months ago, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Mark started bringing up ideas I didn't recognize. Selling the house, moving into something smaller, liquidating assets, freeing up capital, he called it. He'd bring it up over breakfast, casual, like he was discussing the weather. He'd say things like, "You know, Claire, we're sitting on a lot of equity. We could sell, buy something smaller, and have real financial security." I'd ask him what he meant by security. Weren't we already secure? And he'd get this look, frustrated, like I wasn't understanding something obvious. He'd say, "Things are changing. Healthcare costs are rising. We need to be smart." I didn't argue, but I didn't feel right about it either. My hands always got cold when he talked about it, a physical response I couldn't control. That was the first time I ignored my own instincts. I should have asked more questions. I should have demanded to see the papers. I should have asked why, after 40 years of stability, he suddenly felt we were in danger. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself he knew best. I told myself that questioning him would mean I didn't trust him. And I'd built my entire identity on being a woman who trusted her husband. The office that night was too perfect, too clean. Mark's desk was organized in a way it never was at home. At home, his desk was covered in sticky notes, coffee rings, stacks of papers he swore he'd file eventually. But here, everything was precise. Labeled folders, a desktop computer with 2 monitors, a leather briefcase I didn't recognize sitting open on the side table, documents visible inside. And Julie, standing there in a blazer and slacks that looked too professional for 9:30 at night, holding a folder against her chest like a shield. She looked at me like I was the intruder. Like I was the one who didn't belong in my own husband's office. Mark stood up fast, his chair rolling backward and hitting the credenza with a dull thud. His face went pale under the fluorescent lights. Not the pale of surprise, the pale of being caught. He said my name, just my name, Claire, like it was a question, like he wasn't sure why I was real, like he'd been living in a version of reality where I would never show up, where I would never know, where he could keep his secrets and his plans, and I would just stay home, trusting and obedient and blind. I looked at Julie, really looked at her. She was young enough to be our daughter, 28, maybe 30 at most. She had worked for Mark for 2 years, maybe 3. I had met her once at a company holiday party at the community center downtown. She'd seemed sweet then, eager, the kind of young professional who still believed hard work would save her from debt and disappointment. She'd told me she'd gone to law school at the state university, graduated with honors, passed the bar on her first try. She'd said working for Mark was like a mentorship, that he was teaching her everything about small-town legal work. I'd been proud of him that night, proud that he was investing in someone's future. But now, standing in that cold office, she wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared at the folder in her hands. Her knuckles were white. I asked the only question I could form. My voice sounded strange, too calm, like it belonged to someone else. "What's going on?" The question hung in the air. Mark closed the briefcase. The sound of the brass latches clicking shut was too loud. He walked around the desk, his hands out in front of him, palms up, like he was approaching a wounded animal. He told me I shouldn't have come. Not accusatory, almost apologetic, like my presence was an inconvenience, a problem to be managed. He said he was handling something sensitive, something he didn't want to worry me with. And then he said the thing that made my stomach drop. He said, "Claire, you have to trust me. I'm protecting you." That's when I knew. When someone tells you they're protecting you from something, it usually means they're protecting themselves. I'd read that somewhere. An article about financial abuse, about control masquerading as care. I'd skimmed it months ago, not thinking it applied to me. not thinking my steady, responsible husband could ever be the kind of man who needed to hide things. But standing there, watching him try to manage me, I realized that's exactly what was happening. I looked past him to the desk, to the computer screens. One showed what looked like a real estate listing. Our house. I recognized the front porch, the oak tree in the yard, the address at the top of the page. The other screen showed a document. I couldn't read it from where I stood, but I could see numbers, dollar amounts, legal language, my name. I took a step forward. Mark moved to block me. Not physically aggressive, just in the way. He said, "Claire, don't. Please. Let me explain." But I didn't want his explanation. Not yet. I wanted to see what he'd been hiding. I moved around him, quick enough that he couldn't stop me without grabbing me. And he wouldn't grab me. Not in front of Julie. Not where it would be witnessed. I got close enough to read the screen. It was a purchase agreement. Our house. Sold to Redstone Development Company for $475,000. The closing date was October 15th, 2 weeks away. The seller signatures at the bottom were both of ours. Except I'd never signed it. I'd never even seen it. I turned to Mark. My voice came out quiet, deadly quiet. "Did you sign my name?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at Julie, then back at me, then at the floor. That hesitation told me everything. I said it again, louder. "Did you forge my signature?" Julie spoke then. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She said, "Mrs. Armstrong, I didn't know. Not until last week. I swear I didn't know." Mark turned on her, sharp and fast. "Julie, stop. This is between me and my wife." But Julie shook her head. She looked at me, and I saw something in her face. Guilt, relief, fear. She said, "He told me you'd agreed. He said you'd signed verbally, and he was just handling the paperwork." I believed him. "I'm so sorry." The room tilted. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. My husband had forged my signature. He'd sold our home, our life, without telling me, without asking. And he'd done it so smoothly, so carefully, that even his own employee hadn't realized it was fraud until it was almost too late. I heard my own breathing, loud, ragged. I looked at Mark and asked him why. He ran his hands through his hair, the way he always did when he was stressed. He said, "Claire, we're running out of time. We're running out of money. If we don't sell now, we're going to lose everything." I said, "Lose everything to what?" He didn't answer. He just said, "Please, trust me. I know what I'm doing." But I didn't trust him. Not anymore. I looked at Julie and said, "Give me copies of everything." She hesitated, looked at Mark. He said, "Julie, don't. You work for me." But Julie opened the folder in her hands. She pulled out a stack of papers and held them out to me. She said, "These are duplicates. I made them this afternoon, just in case." Her hands were shaking. I took the papers. I didn't look at them yet. I just held them against my chest and walked toward the door. Mark said my name. "Claire, wait. We need to talk about this." I stopped. I turned. I said, "No, you needed to talk about this 6 months ago. Before you lied to me. Before you stole from me. Before you decided I didn't matter." Then I left. I walked out of that office, down the hallway, into the elevator, through the lobby, out into the September night. The air was cool. I could hear traffic in the distance. A siren somewhere. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat there in the parking garage with the papers in my lap and my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't go home. Not right away. I couldn't. I drove aimlessly for a while, through streets I'd known my whole life, past the diner where Mark and I used to go for breakfast on Sundays, past the elementary school where our kids had learned to read, past the church where we'd been married. Everything looked the same. But I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time, like I'd been living in a dream and had just woken up to find the world was different than I thought. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store and sat there under the fluorescent lights with the engine running. I finally looked at the papers Julie had given me. The purchase agreement was first, $475,000. A good price, I suppose. More than we'd paid, more than I'd expected. But it didn't matter. It wasn't the money. It was the fact that he'd decided without me, that he'd made a plan for my life and hadn't included me in it. I flipped through the other documents. There was a deed transfer, a preliminary title search, an email chain between Mark and someone named Richard Howell at Redstone Development. In one email, dated 3 months ago, Richard had asked if Mark had discussed the sale with his spouse. Mark's response was brief. "She's on board. Leave it to me." 3 words, a lie, typed casually, like it meant nothing. There was more. A mortgage application. Against the house we'd paid off 20 years ago. Mark had applied to take out a new mortgage for $200,000. The application was dated 8 months ago. It had been approved. The money had been disbursed. Where had it gone? I flipped through more papers, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. There was a credit card statement. Not one I recognized. In both our names, $63,000 in charges. Medical expenses, it looked like, but not recent ones. These were from 3 years ago. Had Mark been sick? Had he hidden that too? I saw charges for specialists, oncology consultations, imaging centers. My mind raced. Had he had cancer? Was that what this was about? But no, I would have known. You can't hide cancer treatment. There would have been appointments, recovery time, scars. Unless the treatments weren't for him. I kept looking. There was a letter from a collections agency, addressed to Mark, dated 4 months ago, demanding payment for outstanding medical debt in the amount of $97,000. It threatened legal action, wage garnishment, liens against property. Another letter, from a different agency, this one for $42,000, and another, and another. I sat there in that parking lot and realized my husband hadn't been protecting our future. He'd been hiding our past. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the security guard to tap on my window and ask if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was drowning. But I didn't know how to explain that to a stranger. I started the car and drove home. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. I'd left in such a hurry that I hadn't turned on any lights. I sat in the car and stared at the house, our house. For 37 years, it had been the one constant in my life, the place where I'd felt safe, where I'd raised my children, where I'd thought I'd grow old with the man I loved. Now it felt like a lie, like everything else. I went inside. The air smelled like the lavender candles I'd lit that morning, like normalcy. I dropped my purse on the kitchen counter and spread the papers out on the table. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. I sat down and went through everything again, slowly, carefully, trying to understand. The medical debt was real. The names on the bills were Mark's, but the treatments were from 3 years ago. I tried to remember that time. Had he been sick? He'd lost weight, I remembered that. He'd said he was trying to be healthier, eating better, going to the gym. I'd thought it was a midlife thing, a desire to feel young again. Had he lied about that too? My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. "I'm sorry. I'll explain everything tomorrow. I promise." I stared at the message. Sorry. Like that word could fix this. Like an apology could erase fraud. I didn't respond. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark kitchen until the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just sat there, holding a now cold cup of tea, and tried to figure out who I'd been married to for 40 years. Because the man I thought I knew wouldn't do this. The man I thought I knew would have told me if he was sick, would have asked for help, would have trusted me the way I'd trusted him. But maybe that man had never existed. Maybe I'd been in love with an idea, a projection, a carefully maintained image, and now the image had cracked, and I could see what was underneath. Fear, pride, the desperate need to control everything, because admitting vulnerability felt like failure. I understood it, in a way. Men of Mark's generation were taught to be providers, to handle things, to never show weakness. But understanding didn't mean forgiving, and it didn't mean I was going to let him destroy me to save himself. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I called my sister Diane. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. "Claire, what's wrong?" I told her everything. The office, the documents, the forged signature, the hidden debt, the medical bills I didn't understand. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence. Then she said, "Claire, you need a lawyer. Not Mark, not someone he knows, someone who works for you." She gave me a name, Angela Briggs, a woman who specialized in family law and financial disputes. Diane said Angela had helped a friend of hers through a difficult divorce. She said Angela was tough, smart, and didn't take any nonsense from anyone. She said, "Call her today. Don't wait. Don't give Mark time to hide anything else." I wrote down the number. I said, "Diane, what if I'm overreacting? What if there's an explanation? She said, then he can explain it to you through a lawyer, with documentation, with proof, not just words. Words are cheap. I knew she was right. I called Angela's office as soon as it opened. I got an appointment for that afternoon. Then I showered, dressed in clothes that made me feel strong, a charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn in years, and waited. Mark came home at 10. I heard his car in the driveway, heard him come through the front door. He found me sitting at the kitchen table with all the documents spread out in front of me. He stopped in the doorway. He looked exhausted, defeated. He said, "Claire, please, let me explain." I gestured to the empty chair across from me. I said, "Sit." He sat. He folded his hands on the table like a child about to be scolded. I said, "Tell me about the medical bills." He closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. Then he started talking. He said 3 years ago he'd found a lump. He'd gone to the doctor without telling me. He'd been terrified. They'd done tests, biopsies, imaging. It had taken weeks to get results. He said he didn't tell me because he didn't want me to worry, because he thought it would be nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It was cancer. Stage 2. Treatable, they said, but aggressive. He'd needed surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. He'd scheduled everything around my book club meetings, my volunteer days, times when I wouldn't notice his absence. He'd told me he had client meetings, court dates, consultations. He'd driven himself to treatments, sat in waiting rooms alone, come home and pretended everything was fine. I stared at him. I said, "How did I not know? How did I not see?" He said, "Because I didn't want you to, because I was ashamed, because I thought I could handle it myself." I said, "You had cancer, and you didn't tell your wife." He said, "I didn't want to burden you. I wanted to protect you." There was that word again, protect. The word he used to justify every lie. I asked him if he was okay now, if the cancer was gone. He said yes. The treatments had worked. He'd been in remission for 2 years, but the bills had destroyed us. His insurance had covered some of it, but not everything. There were experimental treatments, out-of-network specialists, medications that cost thousands of dollars. He'd maxed out credit cards, taken out loans, refinanced the house without telling me. And when the bills kept coming, when the collection agencies started calling, he'd panicked. He'd thought if he could sell the house, pay off the debt, start fresh, everything would be okay. He'd thought I'd understand eventually, that I'd forgive him. I looked at this man, this stranger wearing my husband's face, and said, "You thought wrong." He reached across the table for my hand. I pulled away. He said, "Claire, I was dying. I didn't want you to watch me die. I didn't want to put you through that." I said, "So you put me through this instead. You lied to me. You hid a life-threatening illness. You committed fraud. You tried to sell our home without my consent. And you think that's protecting me?" He said, "I know I made mistakes." I said, "Mistakes are forgetting an anniversary. This is betrayal. This is you deciding I'm not strong enough to handle real life, that I'm not your partner, that I'm a child who needs to be managed." He didn't argue. He just sat there, looking at his hands, and said, "What do you want me to do?" I told him I'd hired a lawyer. His head snapped up. He said, "Claire, don't do that. We can figure this out." I said, "We had 37 years to figure things out together. You chose to do it alone. Now I'm choosing to do the same." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He said, "You're going to destroy me." "I'm already destroyed, Claire. The business is barely holding on. The debts are crushing me. If you fight me on this, if you stop the sale, we'll lose everything. The house, the retirement accounts, everything." I stood up too. I said, "Then maybe we deserve to lose it, because we built it on lies." He stared at me like I'd slapped him. Then he grabbed his keys and left. I heard his car peel out of the driveway. I sat back down at the table and finally cried, not because I was scared, but because I was grieving. The man I thought I'd married didn't exist. Maybe he never had. Angela Briggs' office was exactly what I needed. Practical, no nonsense. Her desk was organized but not sterile. There were photos of what looked like grown children. A coffee mug that said, "Nevertheless," she persisted. A stack of case files with sticky notes flagging important pages. Angela herself was in her early 50s, with short gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She shook my hand firmly and gestured for me to sit. She said, "Tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." So I did. I told her about the office, about Julie, about the forged signature, about the medical debt Mark had hidden, about the cancer he'd survived without telling me, about the mortgage he'd taken out against our paid-off house, about the collection letters, about his insistence that selling was the only option. Angela took notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against the desk. She said, "Mrs. Armstrong, your husband has committed several felonies: forgery, fraud, possibly identity theft depending on how the mortgage application was processed. You have significant legal grounds to stop this sale, file for separation or divorce, and potentially press criminal charges." I felt my throat tighten. Criminal charges. Against Mark, the father of my children, the man who'd made me breakfast every Sunday for 40 years, who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral, who'd taught our son to ride a bike. I said, "I don't want him in prison. I just want the truth. I want control of my own life." Angela nodded. She said, "Then here's what we do. First, we file an emergency injunction to stop the sale. Second, we notify Redstone Development that the transaction is fraudulent. Third, we freeze all joint accounts and get you set up with independent finances. Fourth, we request full financial disclosure from Mark. Every account, every debt, every asset. And fifth, we make it very clear that if he attempts any further unauthorized transactions, you will pursue criminal charges. Does that sound reasonable?" I said, "It sounds terrifying." She smiled. Not a warm smile, a warrior's smile. She said, "Good. Terrified means you're paying attention. We're going to fix this." The injunction was filed that afternoon. Angela moved faster than I thought possible. By the next morning, Mark knew. He called me 7 times before 9 a.m. I didn't answer. Then he showed up at the house. I'd changed the deadbolt, just as Angela had advised. He couldn't get in with his key. He knocked, pounded, really. He called my name through the door. "Claire, please, you don't understand what you're doing. Open the door." I stood on the other side, my hand pressed against the wood, and said, "I understand perfectly. You lied to me. You forged legal documents. You tried to sell our home without my consent. That's what I understand." He said, "I was trying to save us." I said, "You were trying to save yourself, and you didn't care what it cost me." He slammed his hand against the door, not violently, desperately. He said, "The developer is going to walk away. We'll lose the offer. We'll be buried in debt. They'll come after the house anyway. They'll foreclose. We'll lose everything and have nothing to show for it." I said, "Then we'll face it together. Honestly, like we should have done 3 years ago." He said, "I can't do this without you." I said, "You've been doing it without me for years. What's the difference now?" He didn't have an answer. I heard him lean against the door, heard him slide down until I imagined he was sitting on the porch. He said quietly, "I was scared, Claire. I was so scared, and I didn't know how to tell you." I said, "Being scared doesn't give you the right to lie." He sat there for a long time. Then I heard him stand up, heard him walk away, heard his car start. I went into the living room and watched through the window as he drove off. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. But I didn't open the door. I didn't call him back. I'd spent 40 years putting his needs above mine, his fear above my truth, his comfort above my dignity. Not anymore. The next few days were a blur of legal motions and financial maneuvers. Angela got the injunction approved. She sent a formal letter to Redstone Development explaining that the sale was unauthorized and that any attempt to proceed would result in legal action. She froze our joint accounts. She helped me open new accounts in my name only. She requested full financial disclosure from Mark, backed by court order, and she prepared me for what was coming next. She said, "Mark is going to fight back, not because he wants to hurt you, but because he's desperate. Desperate people do unpredictable things." She was right. Mark hired his own lawyer, a man named Philip Cortland, who had a reputation for being aggressive and expensive. Within 48 hours, I received a letter on Cortland's letterhead. It was brutal. It accused me of acting irrationally, of sabotaging our financial future out of spite, of being unduly influenced by outside parties who didn't understand our situation. It suggested I was mentally unstable, that I'd always been the one who couldn't handle stress, who fell apart during crises, who needed Mark to manage everything because I lacked the capacity. It claimed Mark had always made financial decisions because I'd deferred to him, because I'd wanted him to, because I wasn't capable of understanding complex matters. It painted me as fragile, confused, manipulated. Every word was carefully chosen to make me sound incompetent, to make Mark sound like a devoted husband trying to protect his incapacitated wife. I read that letter 3 times. The first time I felt rage. The second time I felt shame, because there was a kernel of truth in it. I had deferred to Mark. I had let him handle the finances. I had trusted him to make decisions. But that didn't make me incompetent. It made me human. It made me someone who'd chosen to trust her partner, and he'd weaponized that trust. The third time I read it, I felt clarity. This was who Mark really was. Not the man who made me breakfast, not the man who'd held my hand, but the man who, when cornered, would destroy my reputation to save himself. I called Angela. I said, "I want to fight this. All of it." She said, "Good, because he's going to come at you hard. We need to be ready." We requested a hearing. The judge scheduled it for October 10th, 5 days before the original closing date. The hearing would determine whether the injunction stayed in place, whether the sale was fraudulent, and whether Mark had any legal standing to make financial decisions without my consent. Angela said, "This is going to get ugly. He's going to bring up every time you've ever been emotional, every time you've ever made a mistake, every time you've ever leaned on him. He's going to try to make you look incompetent. You need to stay calm, stick to the facts, and let the documents speak for themselves. The documents don't lie. People do." I said, "What if the judge believes him? What if I lose?" She said, "Then we appeal, but you're not going to lose, because you have the truth on your side, and eventually the truth wins." I wanted to believe her, but I'd spent 3 years living with a lie, and I wasn't sure I believed in truth anymore. The days leading up to the hearing were the longest of my life. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I kept going over every conversation I'd ever had with Mark, trying to figure out when the lying had started. Had it been 3 years ago with the cancer? Or earlier? Had our entire marriage been a performance? I didn't know anymore. Julie called me. She said she'd been subpoenaed to testify. She said Mark had fired her after I'd left his office that night. She said she'd filed a wrongful termination complaint, but that didn't matter right now. What mattered was that she was willing to tell the truth. She said, "Mrs. Armstrong, I have copies of everything. Every document he asked me to prepare, every email he sent, every instruction he gave. I'm going to tell the judge exactly what happened. You're not alone in this." I thanked her. I asked her why she was risking so much for me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mom went through something similar. My dad controlled everything, made every decision. When he died, she found out he'd gambled away their savings. She had nothing, no life insurance, no retirement. She had to move in with me, and I was just out of college. I watched her lose everything because she'd trusted someone who didn't deserve it. I won't let that happen to you." I said, "I'm sorry about your mother." She said, "Me too. That's why I'm going to help you." I hung up and cried, not from sadness, from gratitude. This young woman, who barely knew me, was willing to risk her career to tell the truth. Meanwhile, the man I'd given 40 years of my life to was willing to destroy me to save himself. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I got up at 2 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. I looked around the house, the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, the living room where we'd opened Christmas presents, the hallway where we'd marked our kids' heights on the wall. Every inch of this place held memories, but memories aren't enough to build a life on. I thought about what Mark had said, that we'd lose everything if I fought him, that the debt would crush us, that we'd end up with nothing. Maybe he was right. Maybe fighting him would cost me this house, the retirement accounts, the financial security I'd thought we had. But if I didn't fight, what would I have? A life built on lies. A marriage where I was a managed asset instead of a partner. A future where I'd always wonder what else he was hiding. I'd rather lose everything and have my dignity than keep everything and lose myself. I went back to bed. I still didn't sleep, but I felt ready. The courthouse was cold. I wore the same charcoal gray suit I'd worn to Angela's office. I wanted to look competent, strong, not the fragile, confused woman Mark's lawyer had described. Angela met me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was carrying a leather folder stuffed with documents. She said, "Remember, short answers. Stick to the facts. Don't let Cortland bait you into an emotional response. You're calm, you're clear, and you're telling the truth. That's all you need to do." Mark was already inside when we entered. He was sitting at a table with Philip Cortland, both of them in dark suits. Mark looked older than I'd ever seen him, thinner, grayer. There were dark circles under his eyes. When I walked in, he looked up. Our eyes met for just a second. I saw something there. Regret, maybe, or fear. But I looked away. I couldn't afford sympathy right now. The judge was a woman in her mid-60s named Judge Patricia Hendricks. She had short silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the expression of someone who'd heard every excuse in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. She looked at both sides and said, "This is a preliminary hearing on an emergency injunction filed by Claire Armstrong to stop the sale of marital property. Let's keep this focused and fact-based. Mrs. Armstrong, you filed this injunction. Your attorney can present your case." Angela stood. She was calm, professional, precise. She said, "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of fraud and forgery. Mr. Armstrong attempted to sell jointly owned marital property without his wife's knowledge or consent. He forged her signature on multiple legal documents, including a purchase agreement, deed transfer, and mortgage application. We have evidence of these forgeries. We have testimony from his own employee that he instructed her to proceed with the sale under false pretenses. And we have documentation that he concealed significant financial information from Mrs. Armstrong for years. This isn't a marital dispute. It's criminal fraud." Angela entered the documents into evidence: the purchase agreement with my forged signature, the deed transfer, the mortgage application. She called Julie to the stand. Julie wore a simple black dress and looked terrified. But when Angela asked her to describe her role in Mark's office, her voice was steady. She said, "I was Mr. Armstrong's legal assistant for 2 years. 6 months ago, he asked me to help him prepare documents for the sale of his home. He told me his wife had agreed to the sale, but was emotionally resistant to the process, so he was handling the paperwork himself. He asked me to prepare a purchase agreement. I did. I asked him if Mrs. Armstrong needed to sign. He said he'd take care of it. A week later, he gave me the signed agreement. I didn't question it at the time. But when I filed copies with the county clerk, I noticed the signature looked different from Mrs. Armstrong's signature on other documents in the file. When I asked Mr. Armstrong about it, he told me it was fine, that she'd signed it in a hurry. But I didn't believe him." Angela said, "What did you do then?" Julie said, "I made copies of everything. And when Mrs. Armstrong came to the office that night, I knew I had to tell her the truth." Philip Cortland stood up. He said, "Your Honor, Ms. Sinclair is a disgruntled former employee who was terminated for cause. Her testimony is biased." Julie turned to the judge. She said, "I was fired for telling Mrs. Armstrong the truth. That's the cause." Judge Hendricks made a note. She said, "Continue, Ms. Briggs." Angela called me to the stand. I swore to tell the truth. My hand was shaking on the Bible. She asked me simple questions. "Did you know your husband was planning to sell your home?" "No." "Did you sign the purchase agreement?" "No." "Did you authorize your husband to sign on your behalf?" "No." "Did you know he'd taken out a mortgage against your paid-off home?" "No." "Did you know about his medical debt?" "No." Each answer felt like a punch. Each no was an admission of how blind I'd been, how much I hadn't known about my own life. Philip Cortland's cross-examination was brutal. He said, "Mrs. Armstrong, isn't it true that your husband has handled all financial matters for your entire marriage?" I said, "We made decisions together." He said, "But he managed the accounts, paid the bills, filed the taxes, correct?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Because you preferred it that way." I said, "Because I trusted him." He said, "And isn't it true that you've never worked outside the home? That you've been financially dependent on your husband for 40 years? Angela objected. She said, "Relevance, Your Honor." Judge Hendricks said, "Get to your point, Mr. Cortland." He said, "My point is that Mrs. Armstrong has never demonstrated financial competence or interest. She deferred to her husband because she lacked the capacity to manage complex financial matters. He was protecting her, not defrauding her." I felt my face flush. I wanted to scream, but Angela had told me to stay calm. I said, "Being a homemaker doesn't make me incompetent, and trusting my husband doesn't give him the right to forge my signature." Cortland said, "Isn't it true that you've struggled with anxiety, that you've taken medication for it?" Angela objected again. She said, "Your Honor, Mrs. Armstrong's medical history is irrelevant and protected." Judge Hendricks sustained the objection. She said, "Mr. Cortland, move on." Cortland said, "Mrs. Armstrong, "Did your husband tell you he'd been diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago?" I said, "No." He said, "Why do you think that is?" I said, "Because he's a liar." Cortland said, "Or because he didn't want to burden you with something you couldn't handle." I looked at the judge. I said, "Your Honor, my husband didn't hide his cancer to protect me. He hid it so he could make decisions without my input, so he could take out loans, max out credit cards, and sell our home without having to answer to anyone. That's not protection, that's control." Judge Hendricks looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Mark. She said, "Mr. Armstrong, stand up." Mark stood. He looked like he might be sick. Judge Hendricks said, "Did you forge your wife's signature on the purchase agreement?" Mark said, "I signed her name, yes, but I believed I was acting in our best interest." Judge Hendricks said, "Did you ask her permission?" Mark said, "No, but I knew she would resist. I was trying to prevent us from losing everything." Judge Hendricks took off her glasses. She leaned forward. She said, "Mr. Armstrong, I've been on the bench for 23 years. I've seen a lot of things. Good people making bad choices, desperate situations leading to poor decisions. But what you did isn't a poor decision. It's a crime. You forged your wife's signature. You attempted to sell marital property without her consent. You concealed financial information. And you did it all under the guise of protection. That's not protection. That's abuse." The courtroom was silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Judge Hendricks said, "The injunction stays in place. The sale is void. Mrs. Armstrong is granted sole control of the marital home pending further proceedings. Mr. Armstrong, you are not to enter the property without written permission from Mrs. Armstrong or her attorney. I'm also referring this matter to the district attorney's office for review. You're fortunate your wife isn't pressing charges yet. As for the financial matters, I'm ordering full disclosure. Every account, every debt, every asset. You have 30 days to provide a complete accounting to Mrs. Armstrong's attorney. If you fail to comply, or if you attempt any further unauthorized transactions, I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand?" Mark said, "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was barely audible. Judge Hendricks said, "We're adjourned." The bailiff called the next case. Angela gathered her papers. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked out of the courtroom. Outside in the hallway, I leaned against the wall and tried to catch my breath. I'd won. The judge had seen through Mark's justifications. She'd called it what it was, abuse, but it didn't feel like winning. It felt like everything breaking apart. Angela said, "You did great. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but you did everything right." I said, "What happens now?" She said, "Now we wait for the financial disclosure, and we figure out what you want your life to look like moving forward." I said, "I don't know what I want." She said, "That's okay. You don't have to know yet. You just have to keep moving forward." Mark tried to approach me in the hallway. Cortland grabbed his arm, but Mark shook him off. He walked up to me, his face pale, his hands shaking. He said, "Claire, I know I don't deserve to talk to you, but please, just hear me out. I was trying to save us. I was trying to fix the mess I'd made." I looked at him, this man I'd loved, this man I'd trusted, and I said, "The mess you made was lying to me, and you tried to fix it with more lies. That's not love, Mark. That's cowardice." He said, "I was scared." I said, "So was I. Every day of this. But I didn't lie to you. I didn't forge your name. I didn't sell your life out from under you." He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I walked away. Angela followed me. We left the courthouse and stood in the parking lot. The October air was cool and crisp. The sun was bright. Everything felt surreal. Angela said, "Go home. Rest. Take care of yourself. I'll call you in a few days when we have the financial disclosure." I nodded. I got in my car. I drove home through streets that looked the same, but felt different. I pulled into the driveway of the house Mark had tried to sell. "My house now," the judge had said. I went inside. I locked the door behind me, and I sat on the floor of the living room and cried, not because I was sad, but because I'd survived. The weeks that followed were strange, quiet in a way I wasn't used to. The house felt bigger without Mark in it, emptier, but also mine in a way it hadn't been before. I went through every room and took stock. What was mine? What was his? What was ours? I packed up his things, clothes, papers, books. I put them in boxes and stacked them in the garage. He could pick them up whenever he was ready. I changed the locks on all the doors. I changed the passwords on all the accounts I could access. I set up new bank accounts in my name only. I got my own credit card. Small steps toward independence. Angela called with updates. Mark's financial disclosure had come through. It was worse than I'd thought. The medical debt was real. $97,000 to one collection agency, $42,000 to another, $33,000 to a third. The credit card debt was $108,000 across 4 cards. The mortgage he'd taken out against the house was for $200,000, and there was still $160,000 left on it. He'd paid off some of the medical bills, but not all. He'd been juggling payments, moving money around, trying to keep everything from collapsing. The retirement accounts were smaller than I'd thought. He'd taken early withdrawals to cover expenses. There were penalties, taxes. What should have been close to $400,000 was down to $270,000. Angela said, "Mrs. Armstrong, here's the reality. You have assets, but you also have significant debt. If you want to keep the house, you'll need to figure out how to pay off that mortgage. If you sell, you'll have enough to cover the debt and have something left over. But not much." I said, "How did this happen? How did we go from being stable to being buried?" She said, "Your husband got sick. He panicked. He made bad financial decisions. And instead of asking for help, he tried to handle it alone. It's not uncommon, but it's devastating." I asked her what she recommended. She said, "That depends on what you want. Do you want to try to reconcile with Mark? Or do you want to move forward alone?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "You don't have to decide today, but you do need to think about what your life looks like now. Not the life you thought you'd have, the life you actually have." I hung up and sat with that question. What did my life look like now? I was 62 years old. I'd been a wife and mother my entire adult life. I'd never had a career, never had my own income. I'd always been dependent on Mark, and now he was gone. Not dead, but gone from my life in every way that mattered. I could try to rebuild the marriage. I could forgive him. I could work with him to pay off the debt. I could choose the familiar over the unknown, or I could start over, alone. At 62, it was terrifying, but for the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't fear or anger or grief. I felt possibility. I called my kids, Danny first. He was 34, married, living 2 states away with his wife and their 2 daughters. I hadn't told him much about what was happening, just that his father and I were going through a difficult time. He'd been supportive, but distant, the way adult children are when their parents' problems feel too big to navigate. I told him everything: the cancer, the debt, the forged signature, the court hearing. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I didn't want to put you in the middle, because I didn't want you to have to choose sides." He said, "I'm not choosing sides. I'm choosing you. If you need help, if you need money, if you need anything, just tell me." I said, "I just need you to understand." He said, "I do, and for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself. I didn't think you would." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because you've always been so loyal to Dad, even when he didn't deserve it." I realized my son had seen things I hadn't, or things I'd chosen not to see. I called Michelle next. She was 31, single, living in the city and working in marketing. She'd always been more direct than her brother. When I told her what had happened, she said, "Mom, I'm going to say something you might not want to hear, but I love you, so I'm going to say it anyway. Dad has always been controlling. You've always let him be, and I've watched you shrink yourself for years. If this is what it took for you to finally stand up for yourself, then maybe it's not the worst thing that could have happened." I was quiet. She said, "I'm not saying he was right. He wasn't. What he did was awful. But you're finally fighting back, and I'm so proud of you for that." Thanksgiving came. Diane invited me to her house. I almost said no. I didn't feel like celebrating, but she insisted. She said, "Claire, you're not spending the holiday alone. Come here, eat turkey, watch football, let people love you." So I went. Her house was full of noise and laughter. Her kids, their spouses, grandchildren running around. It was chaotic and warm, and the opposite of the silence I'd been living in. After dinner, Diane and I sat on her back porch with mugs of coffee. She said, "How are you really doing?" I said, "I don't know. Some days I'm okay. Some days I can't get out of bed." She said, "That's normal. You're grieving, not just the marriage, but the person you thought you knew." I said, "I keep thinking I should have seen it coming. I should have asked more questions." She said, You trusted your husband. That's not a character flaw. That's what marriage is supposed to be. He's the one who broke the contract, not you. I said, I don't know what to do now. I don't know how to be alone. She said, yes, you do. You've been handling everything for the last 2 months. You hired a lawyer. You went to court. You stood up for yourself. You're already doing it. I said, it doesn't feel like enough. She said, it's more than enough. Give yourself credit. I sat there, looking at the stars, and realized she was right. I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I hadn't noticed what I'd gained. Courage, clarity, control of my own life. It wasn't everything, but it was something. December was hard. The holidays had always been Mark's favorite time of year. He'd decorate the house, inside and out. He'd put lights on the roof, a wreath on the door, a tree in the living room. He'd play Christmas music and make hot chocolate and insist we watch every cheesy holiday movie. I'd always teased him about it, called him a sentimental fool, but I'd loved it too. This year, I didn't feel like decorating. I didn't feel festive, but I also didn't want to surrender to sadness. So I put up a small tree, just a 4-foot artificial one I found in the attic. I strung some lights. I hung a few ornaments. It wasn't much, but it was something. A statement that I was still here, still living, still trying. Julie sent me a card. She'd left Mark's firm and gotten a job with a non-profit legal clinic that helped low-income families with housing disputes. She said it felt right, that she was finally doing work that mattered. She thanked me for not blaming her, for understanding that she'd been caught in the middle. I wrote back. I told her she'd saved me, that without her courage, I might never have known the truth. I told her I was proud of her, that she was going to help a lot of people. On Christmas Eve, I got a letter from Mark. No return address, just my name on the envelope in his handwriting. Inside was a single page, handwritten. His handwriting was shaky, like he'd been crying or drinking or both. It said, Claire, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I broke something that can't be fixed, but I need you to know that everything I did because I loved you. I didn't want you to see me weak. I didn't want you to watch me suffer. I thought I could handle it alone. I thought I could fix it before you ever had to know. I was wrong. I've lost you. I've lost the house. I've lost everything that mattered, and I only have myself to blame. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm not asking for another chance. I just need you to know that I'm sorry, and that I still love you. Even if you hate me, even if you never speak to me again, I'll always love you. I read that letter 3 times. The first time I felt anger. How dare he talk about love after what he'd done? The second time I felt sadness. For him, for me, for the life we'd lost. The third time I felt nothing, just emptiness. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer with all the other documents from the last 3 months. Maybe someday I'd know what to do with it, but not yet. Christmas morning, I woke up alone. I made myself coffee. I sat by the little tree and opened the presents my kids had sent. A scarf from Michelle, a book from Danny, a framed photo of my grandchildren from both of them. I called them both. They said Merry Christmas. They asked if I was okay. I said I was. They said they loved me. I said I loved them too. It wasn't the Christmas I'd imagined, but it was mine, and that counted for something. The new year came, 2026. I made resolutions the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves that change is possible. Take a class, volunteer, learn to manage my own finances, figure out what I wanted my life to look like. I signed up for a personal finance class at the community college. It felt ridiculous at first. Me, at 62, sitting in a classroom with strangers, learning about budgets and credit scores and retirement planning. But it also felt empowering, like I was taking control of something I'd given away a long time ago. The instructor was a woman in her 40s named Karen Delgado. She was patient and clear and made everything feel manageable. She didn't talk down to us. She didn't assume we were incompetent. She just taught. After the 3rd class, she asked me to stay behind. She said, Claire, can I ask you something? You ask more questions than anyone else in this class. Are you dealing with something specific? I hesitated. Then I told her. Not everything. Just the basics. That my husband had hidden financial information. That I'd discovered debt I didn't know about. That I was trying to figure out how to move forward. She listened. Then she said, You're not the first person to go through this, and you won't be the last. But the fact that you're here, learning, asking questions, that's huge. A lot of people just give up. I said, I thought about giving up. She said, "But you didn't. That's what matters." She gave me some resources, books, websites, the name of a financial planner who specialized in helping people rebuild after financial trauma. I went home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the naive hope of thinking everything would magically get better, but the grounded hope of knowing I had options, that I could learn, that I could build something new. It wasn't much, but it was a start. By February, I'd made some decisions. I was going to keep the house. It would be hard. I'd have to figure out how to pay off the mortgage Mark had taken out. But selling felt like letting him win, like admitting that his decisions, his lies, his betrayals, had the power to take away the one thing I'd worked for my entire adult life. Angela helped me refinance the mortgage in my name only. The payments would be tight, but manageable if I was careful. I got a part-time job at the library. It wasn't much, 15 hours a week, minimum wage, but it was mine, my income, my contribution. I wasn't dependent on Mark anymore. I wasn't dependent on anyone. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching a class on financial literacy for women, helping them understand contracts, mortgages, rights, the things I'd learned the hard way. It felt good, purposeful, like I was turning my pain into something useful, like maybe all of this had happened for a reason, not a good reason, not a reason I would have chosen, but a reason nonetheless. One evening in late February, Angela called. She said, "Mark's lawyer reached out. Mark wants to know if you'd be willing to meet. Not for legal reasons, just to talk. He says he wants closure." I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, "What do you think?" Angela said, "Honestly, I think closure is overrated. You don't owe him anything. But if you think it would help you, if you think it would give you peace, then do it. Just protect yourself. Meet in public. Don't go alone. And don't let him manipulate you into anything." I thought about it for a week. Every time I started to say yes, I'd remember something. A lie. A forged signature. The way he'd looked at me in court, like I was the one who'd betrayed him. But I also remembered 40 years of marriage, the good parts, the real parts, the parts that had been true before everything fell apart. I agreed to meet him. We met at the same diner where I'd met Julie months ago. Neutral ground, public, safe. Mark was already there when I arrived. He stood when he saw me. He looked different, older, thinner. His hair had gone completely gray. He'd lost weight. He looked fragile in a way I'd never seen before. He said, "Thank you for coming." "I didn't think you would." I sat down across from him. I didn't order anything. I just waited. He folded his hands on the table. He said, "I've been going to therapy, twice a week, trying to understand why I did what I did. My therapist says I have control issues, that I equate love with protection, that I was raised to believe that providing for my family meant shielding them from everything hard or painful or scary. And when I got sick, when I realized I might die, I panicked. I couldn't stand the thought of you watching me deteriorate. I couldn't stand the thought of being weak in front of you. So I lied. And then I kept lying. Because once you start, it's hard to stop." He looked up at me. His eyes were red. He said, "I'm not trying to excuse what I did. I'm just trying to explain. I know I hurt you. I know I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way. And I know I can't fix it. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not because I want you to forgive me, but because you deserve to hear it. I deserve to say it." I looked at him for a long time. This man I'd built a life with. This man who'd broken everything. I said, "Why did you really do it, Mark? And don't give me the therapy answers. Tell me the truth." He was quiet. Then he said, "Because I was ashamed. When I got sick, when I saw the bills piling up, when I realized we were going to lose everything I'd worked for, I felt like a failure. Like I'd let you down. Like I wasn't a good husband or a good provider. And instead of asking for help, instead of admitting I didn't have all the answers, I tried to fix it myself. I thought if I could just solve the problem before you knew there was a problem, then I wouldn't have to admit I'd failed. And when that didn't work, when the debt kept growing, I convinced myself that selling the house was the only option, that it was a sacrifice I had to make for both of us. And I told myself you'd understand eventually, that you'd see I'd done it for the right reasons. But the truth is, I did it for me, to save my ego, to avoid admitting I'd made mistakes. I sacrificed your trust, your autonomy, your dignity, so I wouldn't have to face my own shame. And that's unforgivable. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, but understanding. I said, "You're right. It is unforgivable." He nodded. He said, "I know." I said, "But I'm glad you finally told me the truth, even if it's too late." He said, "What are you going to do now?" I said, "I'm going to live my life. Without you. I'm going to pay off the debt. I'm going to keep the house. I'm going to learn how to manage my own finances. I'm going to teach other women how to protect themselves. I'm going to be okay. Better than okay." He said, "I'm glad. You deserve that." I said, "What about you? What are you going to do?" He said, "I don't know. Keep going to therapy. Try to rebuild my practice. Try to become someone I can respect. It's going to take a long time." I said, "Good luck." He said, "Thank you for everything, for 40 years, for giving me a chance. I'm sorry I ruined it." I stood up. I said, "So am I." Then I walked out. Spring came early that year. The dogwoods bloomed in late March. I planted a garden in the backyard. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, flowers, things I could tend and watch grow. My daughter came to visit with her 2 kids, my granddaughters. They were 7 and 9, full of energy and questions and laughter. We baked cookies. We played in the yard. We watched movies. Michelle sat with me on the back porch one evening while the girls ran around catching fireflies. She said, "You seem different, Mom. Lighter." I said, "I feel different." She said, "Good. You deserve to be happy." I said, "I'm not sure I'm happy yet, but I'm not miserable. And that's progress." She said, "I'm proud of you. You know that, right?" I said, "You've told me." She said, "I'm going to keep telling you until you believe it." We sat there in comfortable silence, watching the girls, watching the sun set, and I realized this was enough. This moment, this peace, this tiny slice of happiness. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. Julie called in April. She said she was getting married to a man she'd met at the legal clinic, a public defender named Marcus. She said he was kind and honest and made her laugh. She said she wanted me to come to the wedding. I said, "Are you sure? That might be awkward." She said, "You're the reason I'm here. You're the reason I stood up for what was right. I want you there." So I went. It was a small ceremony in a botanical garden, simple and beautiful. Julie wore a cream-colored dress. She looked radiant. During the reception, she found me sitting at a table by myself. She sat down beside me. She said, "Thank you for coming. It means a lot." I said, "Thank you for inviting me." She said, "I need to tell you something. When all that happened with Mr. Armstrong, I almost quit. I almost gave up on law entirely. I thought, if this is what it's like, if I have to choose between my job and doing the right thing, I don't want it. But you showed me that sometimes doing the right thing is hard. And that's okay. It's supposed to be hard. That's how you know it matters." I said, "You saved me, Julie. You didn't have to tell me the truth, but you did. And that changed everything." She said, "We saved each other." I hugged her, and I realized that some good had come from the worst time of my life. Maybe that's what healing looks like, not erasing the pain, but finding meaning in it. By summer, I'd established a routine. I worked at the library 3 days a week. I taught my financial literacy class on Thursday evenings. I tended my garden. I read. I spent time with my grandchildren. I had coffee with Diane once a week. I went to a support group for people navigating financial recovery after divorce or separation. I was building a life. It was smaller than the one I'd had, quieter, but it was mine. I wasn't waiting for someone to make decisions for me. I wasn't hoping someone else would save me. I was saving myself, one day at a time, one choice at a time, and slowly, painfully, I was becoming someone I could respect, someone I could trust, someone who knew her own worth. Mark and I didn't speak after that meeting in February. I'd heard through Danny that he'd moved to a smaller apartment across town, that he was working part-time, trying to rebuild his practice, that he seemed lonely but stable. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I didn't feel angry anymore either. He'd made his choices, and I'd made mine. That's how life works. You can't control what other people do. You can only control how you respond. And I'd chosen to respond by refusing to let his betrayal define me, by refusing to become bitter or broken, by choosing to build something new. One evening in late July, I was sitting on the back porch watching the fireflies when my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It said, "Mrs. Armstrong, this is Julie. I wanted to let you know I'm pregnant. 3 months. I'm terrified and excited, and I keep thinking about how you raised 2 kids and made it look easy. Any advice?" I smiled. I wrote back, It's never easy, but it's always worth it. Congratulations. She sent back a heart emoji. I sat there, phone in my hand, and realized something. I was going to be okay. Not because everything was perfect, not because all the problems were solved, but because I'd survived the worst thing I could imagine. I'd faced betrayal, loss, public humiliation, financial devastation, and I was still here, still standing, still fighting, still living. The house still stands, same address, same porch light, same flower bed, but it feels different now. It's not a museum of the past. It's not a shrine to a marriage that didn't make it. It's just a house, my house, where I drink my coffee in the morning and read in the evenings and host my grandkids on weekends, where I'm learning to be alone without being lonely, where I'm learning that starting over at 62 isn't the end of the story. It's just a new chapter. I kept one thing from Mark, a photo from our wedding day. Young, smiling, full of hope. I don't look at it often, but I keep it in a drawer next to his letter, because it reminds me that love is complicated, that people fail, that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild, but also that you can survive the breaking. You can stand in the wreckage and choose to build something new. And maybe that's the real story, not the betrayal, not the courtroom, not the signatures or the documents or the frozen accounts, but the moment you decide you're worth fighting for. That's the moment everything changes. I decided, and I fought, and I won. Not because a judge said so, but because I know, deep in my bones, that I'm going to be okay. Better than okay. I'm going to be free. Free from lies. Free from control. Free from living a life someone else designed for me. This is my life now. Smaller, maybe, quieter, but true. And in the end, truth is the only foundation worth building on. Everything else is just sand. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.